Hello and welcome to the Choirlosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz and this is episode 80, Finding Connection Again with Nicola Dedmon. I will not attempt to offer the perfect answer to these overwhelming dilemmas, and I believe that each choir should be empowered to make decisions that are best for their own unique community. I will, however, say this. If we want our choirs to emerge from this pandemic with a sense of strength, connection, and mutual respect, we must actively work to change the nature of these discussions. We must begin conversations from a place of mutually acknowledged humanity. This is the crux of choral singing and ensembleship. We trust each other when we sit next to one another and share in singing, a vulnerable and deeply personal human activity. We trust each other when we make mistakes in rehearsal and humbly learn from those mistakes in front of others. We trust each other to show up to rehearsals and performances because we cannot begin to accomplish these activities alone. These are not my words. These are the words of Nicola Dedmon, who is the guest in this episode. And I was reading from a recent article that she published over the summer called Finding Connection Again in the Western ACDA's publication, Tactus. And I've got a link to that in the show notes. You can read the whole article. It's one of the things that caught my eye about Nicola, and I knew she had to be a guest on the show. Because if you listen to the show a lot, you probably thought those words were my words. These are some basic tenets and basic principles that we talk about here a lot on the show, which is that conversations, especially the hard ones, and every conversation we have had related to the pandemic as choir people and as human people has been very difficult. Every conversation that's difficult makes it even more important for that conversation to start from a place of mutual respect, a place of mutual humanity, common humanity, universal humanity. That is crucial, or else the conversation is doomed to fail. We're not the best at this in the choir world sometimes, especially because we center all of our conversations around Facebook, and that's toxic. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole today. We are going to be talking with Nicola about her ideas for bringing choirs back after the pandemic in a way that is inclusive and welcoming to everybody, no matter what your opinions about the pandemic were as it was raging the most in your area and during lockdown and during the last year and closed schools and all that kind of stuff. The point that Nicola makes in this article, which is so brilliant, is that at some point, we're going to have rooms of people together who thought just a wide range of different things about the pandemic during the pandemic. And is it our job as directors to welcome all of those people back in making music? I say it is. So you're going to stick around for this conversation and love it because it's going to be a great one. I enjoyed this conversation a lot. Before we get there, just a few quick announcements. Don't forget that it is not too late to get your kids signed up for Sight Reading Factory for the year. You and all of your students need a membership. And they've just added Google Classroom compatibility. So that's a big announcement just this last week. You can now sign in with Google and use Google Classroom with Sight Reading Factory. That's huge. It's just such a great tool. I've just finished our pre-tests for all of our kids. And so that we've set their beginning of the year level so that we could set goals for their individual sight reading growth before the semester. And it's such a worthwhile process. So make sure you use Choirlosophy at checkout to get your discount. And then, of course, you're going to need some resident singers masks. You're going to need choir folders. So head over to mymusicfolders.com and get all your choir gear and enter Choirlosophy at checkout there as well. Without further ado, here is Nicola Dedmon. All right, everybody, I am here with Nicola Dedmon, who is a choir director on one of the coasts. So much be strange to be on a coast. How close to California are you? Or you're in California, right?
I am in California. I'm in Orange County.
And so how close to the ocean are you?
So I'm from the part of Orange County that's not right on the ocean. I'm from North Orange County. So I am about a 25-minute drive from Huntington Beach and Newport Beach and all of that.
Well, poor you. That's
yeah, I was about to say. They've been getting a lot of attention recently, especially this week with the terrible oil spill. So yeah, that's right. That's right in our backyard. So that's been very unfortunate.
Yeah. That has its own set of stresses, I imagine. Unrelated to our conversation tonight about stuff. So interestingly, I can't believe actually that it took as long as it did for the internet algorithm gods to have you cross my path, being
Right.
because obviously on my show we've talked about COVID quite a bit, and then all of a sudden I've got this whole set of this whole Twitter life where I have all these epidemiology friends now just because of my show, and all of a sudden I'm on Ali Krug's page and I see you pop up, and she's talking to a choir director. And what the heck? And I was like, wait a minute, why is there a choir director on this show with Ali? And so that was just fascinating to me. And so first, why don't you just share with the audience a little bit about who you are, your background first, and then I'll ask you some more of those questions about how you got connected with Ali Krug.
Sure. So a bit about my background. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm actually an East Coaster by birth. So my training, I went to James Madison University for my undergrad, and then Westminster Choir College for my master's in conducting. And then I landed the current job that I have, which is at a community college in Orange County, Fullerton College. And I landed that job right out of my master's degree. So when you land a job like that, you move coasts without thinking about it. So I relocated my entire life out to California, and and now I'm here. That was 7 years ago, which is crazy to think about.
That's
so
awesome.
That's a bit about my background.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So how did you get hooked up with talking to an epidemiologist on her podcast?
Well, that's a bit of a different journey. So. Yeah. Like many of us in the choral profession, it was a very daunting experience, to say the least, in March 2020, when seemingly overnight, I have to admit, I was quite naive. I was not paying attention to the COVID news cycle. I knew there was a coronavirus that was concerning, but I thought it was, that's their problem over there. I was one of those very, very naive people. I started first paying attention to it when actually one of my best friends, who's a nurse, sent me a text message the first week of March saying, hey, this is starting to be a big concern. You should be aware of this. And I remember saying to her, I can't take 2 weeks off work. I don't have time. I have concerts, and that was just so naive, not knowing that 2 weeks later, we'd all be taking way more than 2 weeks off of campus life, we'll call it. So in any event, it was a very daunting experience. And so I became somewhat obsessed, and I'm sure I'm not alone here, somewhat obsessed with following the news of COVID, because when overnight I was told, you can't have rehearsals, you can't have your choir, you can't do all of these things, and we don't know when you will return, I became obsessed with chasing the return. And chasing the return meant chasing COVID news. How does it spread? How are we going to get rid of this thing? What do pandemics look like? How do pandemics end? And so that started my COVID news chasing journey, where I followed a bunch of these different epidemiologists and virologists and biologists, all these ists people on Twitter. And now over a year later, my entire Twitter is like med Twitter, which is kind of funny because I have no science background whatsoever. And here I am reading all of this stuff on Twitter. And so I connected with Ali because I engaged in one of her thoughtful threads. I think it was about flu uptake percentages in different communities. And so I was discussing with the role that schools can take in flu shot uptake. And we connected from there. And she's been incredibly generous and kind. And so I really appreciate talking with her.
Yeah, that's crazy. And so then you had a chance to kind of give her what the story of the choir director has been really over the last year.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that she was drawn to talking with me, is because there are a lot of similarities between the sports world and the choral world. And I always find it interesting that we're so seemingly at odds. You always hear, they always have money for the stadium, but they don't have money for the choral program. That's something that we've all heard, and I've even said before. Spoiler alert, I'm not much of an athlete, so I am not from the sports world, but I've come to really have a deep appreciation, a profound appreciation for sports, particularly team sports, because we have so much in common with them when it comes to the way we build community and the way we engage with our players. The coach to team relationship is very similar to the conductor choir relationship. So I think we connected in that way too, because she has such an interest in hockey. And so that was an interesting parallel there.
Right. Yeah, that's really cool. Such a small worlds colliding, I suppose. Let's talk a little bit about the experience of being a choir director in California, and maybe even in contrast to me where I am, because so here's maybe a way we could start that. Percentage of time over the last year that you've been able to meet with your choirs in person.
So let's talk about since the beginning of the pandemic.
Okay, sure.
Percentage of time, I mean, it was zero, in person was zero until March 2021.
Okay.
So I spent a full calendar year on Zoom. And in March 2021, I have to say I have had a really wonderful, supportive administration for a lot of this. Particularly my immediate dean is actually the formal choral director at my program. So he is very sympathetic to what we've gone through as a community. So I was given an opportunity in March of 2021, despite the very, very strict campus protocols. I was given an exception in March 2021 to do a hybrid choral experience that would be optional for the students. Our hopes was that we were going to start it at the beginning of the semester. That didn't pan out, because if you remember what January 2021 looked like, it was not great, particularly not great in Orange County and LA counties. So we weren't able to start the semester that way. So halfway through the semester, they said, okay, you can come back, but it has to be optional because the students have already set up the infrastructure essentially to do an online class. And I think that's completely fair. And remembering also that not everyone had access to the vaccine at this time. So people had mixed feelings about returning. So we brought back a hybrid thing where I went to the third floor of the parking structure and we had outdoor choral rehearsals, masked, spaced out, and I had a laptop in front of me. So I had Zoom as well. That was not fun, but it was more fun than 100% Zoom, in my opinion. And I know some people disagree with that. In my experience, I did enjoy seeing students face-to-face, even if it was very much not the normal experience. This past fall, we're 100% in-person with choirs, which is a blessing. And I do not take that for granted, because I know there are some people still in the state of California that are not so lucky to have that opportunity. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that.
Well, yeah, and that's been such a fascinating thing about this whole experience in our world, is because, we every locality has been living a different pandemic.
Completely.
And so I'm in Missouri, in the Kansas City area. So within the Midwest, I've felt like I've lived a pretty strict version of the pandemic, because like 20 minutes outside of my county, there's been no masks and no shutdowns ever. But in the city area where I live, we've had rules and we've had all this kind of stuff. So but then compared to what you've experienced in California, my experience is probably it's like, I feel like maybe I'm somewhere in the middle. So for example, we didn't obviously have anything in May of 2020, but we did come back to this really weird hybrid of in-person and virtual in August of 2020. And so we had like it was very strange. I actually had some equity concerns with what we did, but I don't think it was anybody did it on purpose. But what they essentially told us was that our choirs that were extracurricular were going to be treated like sports, which means that we get to be in person. But our choirs that were curricular were virtual.
Right.
Okay. Well, the way that exists in my ecosystem is that the extracurricular choirs are the quote unquote elite choirs.
Right.
Which means that our kids that already were really good at singing were the ones that got to keep singing. And the ones that were the beginners, the kids who maybe do it for fun, but they're not as invested in it. We had to tell them, oh, you don't get to sing. You can sing online. And it just was it was a real struggle of course, no one sat down and thought that through. They just like, well, we got to make a rule.
Right.
We got to make a rule. So, and then we just bounced back and forth between virtual and online. So throughout the whole school year, it was just back and forth, nothing consistent. So yeah, it's just been such a strange thing. And I wonder too, I was wanting to ask you, because I love talking to other choir directors about this, but thinking back to May 2020, when the ACDA webinar happened and all of our worlds came crashing down. I always think like, where were you on 9/11, or where were you when JFK was killed? Did you watch that webinar? Like, where were you when that news erupted? A good portion of the behind the scenes support comes from the Patreon page for the Choirosophy podcast. Doing the show is a lot of work. It costs a lot of money, advertising, getting the word out, making sure that there is always content available for you is not cheap, and it's not free. And there are some folks out there in this audience who recognize that. And they see that there is value in their lives from listening to this show. And there is no better way to interact with one person helping another person who helps them. Like, my goodness, that's the golden rule. So on Patreon, you have the opportunity to do that. If this show is valuable for you, you can jump on over there for as little as $3 a month. There are even higher tiers where you can become a producer. You can check in with me for consultancy if you would like to. There's swag to pick up. There's a private podcast feed, all kinds of cool stuff over there. The producers from the Patreon page, that's patreon.com/Choirosophy, are Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Thanks a lot, you guys.
I hate to admit this, but I actually didn't watch it live. I did not watch it live. I can't remember why I didn't. There was a reason that I couldn't, but I can't remember. I was doing something else virtually. I don't know. But I do remember logging onto Facebook and seeing, oh, something happened, because everyone is filled with despair, like completely filled with despair. Uh-huh. And it's interesting because I was not necessarily as pessimistic or panicked as all of the reactions were. I certainly understand why someone would be after then watching the webinar, but and at the same time, I wasn't all that surprised, because again, I had started my COVID obsession, and I read about the now infamous Skagit Valley rehearsal that has just been churned over and over to death. I mean, we've all heard of that. If I made jokes that if I could put a quarter in the jar for every time somebody emails me something about that, oh, have you seen this article? Yes, I've seen the Skagit Valley article. I don't need to read it again. In any event, I wasn't terribly caught off guard by what they were saying in that webinar, so I didn't have that same visceral reaction. And also, I understood, and I took it with a certain grain of salt, knowing, okay, this is what we know now, and hopefully we're going to go through this and learn more and develop more technologies and be more creative with ways that we can make this safer. I knew about that great study that they were doing at CU Boulder, and I was paying a lot of attention to that. So I did end up watching the webinar. I think it was a day or two later, and I sat and I watched the whole thing, and I thought, boy, I understand why people who may not have been mentally prepared for a meeting like this would think my entire career is over. I'm also lucky to be surrounded by a lot of people who are very creative thinkers and are not willing, they're not afraid to come out and say something that might challenge the way people think. And so I had a really close friend who was thinking, oh my gosh, we don't need to despair. Like, this is not going to end our career. Anyway, I guess I'm somewhat in the middle of that. It was a bombshell moment for our community, to say the least. But I wasn't quite as shocked.
Yeah, well, so it was. For me, when I was watching it live, it was. I kind of like you. I had already gone down a COVID rabbit hole, but it was my journey was not news related. I started reaching out to experts like right away. when all of this stuff happened, because I just know how media works. I know how news works. I know that if I get my information from the news, I'm sunk. Because they'll give me correct things, but they'll be in sound bites, and I won't. And kind of like, if you remember what happened after the webinar, the part that went viral was the sound bites that happened afterwards.
Right.
Very rarely is somebody freaking out on Facebook because of something, the hour and a half long presentation in its totality. It's these sound bites that come out of it. So I was trying to avoid that. But the one thing that is true about that webinar, though, and I've kind of hashed this out on this show since then, but the short version is that it was actually full of inaccuracies and things that I call some of my experts friends and say, is this true? Is this a real thing? Like, can you describe? Well, at one point in the webinar, they said we should be careful because we could put ourselves in a situation where a bunch of people get infected with COVID in a choir rehearsal, and 15% of them might die. What are you talking about?
I don't remember that moment. If I'm being 100% honest, I don't recall that.
She was referring to, like, people who are older, which of course they do have a higher risk, but it's never been 15%, and kind of just those types of things. And it was like seemed unnecessarily and of course that created this whole zeitgeist in our profession that. Where we started accepting this idea that there is no level of risk that would be tolerable to get our choirs back. Okay.
Right.
So, and this is kind of what I'm sorry, I'll finish this in just a second and I'll get your reaction, because this is what I want your opinion on, because I feel that we spent a lot of time pre-pandemic as a choir profession talking about how essential we were for people's lives. And we went from being essential workers to it's just choir real fast in that time. And that was my concern. It was like, hey, I thought we changed people's lives. I thought like that people needed us for their souls. And maybe we could react differently. Maybe we could react, how do we make this safer? rather than we can't do it. We can't do it. I'm just wondering if you had any of those similar observations or maybe not. And tell me what you were thinking at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say that I understood, and actually at the time shared in a lot of maybe panic isn't the right word, but heightened a sense of anxiety, we'll say. I shared in some of that at the time, because reading about that Skagit Valley rehearsal was just, it's just that is a huge tragedy when you look at what happened. And I tried to put myself in the position of those choir members and thinking, what if we had a rehearsal and someone died? They had members of their ensemble die. That is just unfathomable. So I definitely shared in a lot of that anxiety. And at the same time, I also completely agree with you that we are absolutely essential. And again, remembering that this was at May 2020. So this was about 8 weeks deep. And I had fully accepted that I wasn't going back that semester. I had let go of any hopes of going back that semester. But I can't remember when my institution announced that we would be virtual in the fall. I honestly can't remember what month that was, but I do remember not knowing what the answer was when that webinar came out. So I was focused on looking forward and being very optimistic about creative solutions. I was someone that was feeling a little bit uncomfortable about just returning to indoor choir the way it was in 2019, absent of a vaccine or something like that. So I did have a good amount of anxiety, and I do understand where those people come from. And I also think that you don't have to discount that, and you don't have to discount those very real feelings of, well, I don't want to take on risk that could potentially lead to this catastrophic scenario. You don't have to discount that very real human emotion to also say, and we have to eventually return. And when we do return, I guess we don't have to, you could quit, but that's not what I intend to do.
Right.
So if you intend to stay in this field, there's going to be a day where we have to return. And when we return, the risk of COVID will not be zero. We kind of, it became clear early on that we were never going to really eradicate this thing. Yep. So I thought that the vaccine would really change a lot of the discussion, and it seemed to for a while. And then this Delta variant stuff happened, and now everyone's freaked out again. And again, I understand. I really understand that anxiety. And also, I am wondering, how are we going to make this journey back into the classroom? And when we do, how are we going to approach situations that are anxious and sometimes legitimately so? But how are we going to have those discussions? How are we going to solve those problems? And how are we going to approach this in a way that brings people together, that fosters a sense of community trust, and not in a way that rips people apart or makes them feel more fear, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that answered your question directly. It kind of
no, it's fine. Those are a lot of good thoughts, and I want to kind of zero in on something in particular that you said, which is that at some point unless you decide to quit being a choral musician, you have to come back, and you will have to come back. As many people already have, of course, but you metaphorically, I suppose, you have to come back, and the risk will not be zero. And I think that is not only a scientific consensus at this point. It is something that, however, though, I don't know if you've come across this, I do feel like choir directors in my life, being a choir director makes you more likely to believe that at some point the risk will be zero. And so, like, people in my normal life don't believe that. But if I know 20 people who believe that at some point COVID risk will go away and then we can do normal things again, they're choir directors. So I'm not sure where I'm not sure where that comes from. Well, I do know where it comes from. It comes from the media coverage that we generated about ourselves during that time. And so I'm wondering if at some point, I feel like we have to not only come back, the risk won't be zero, but we have to become a little bit more comfortable with talking about the risk from COVID as being something that is, well, it's like a thing that we learn to dodge around, not something that not something that stops us from being who we are, if that makes sense. That was kind of a weird way to say it, but.
Right. Well, and I think one of the most difficult things is every step of this is going to be profoundly uncomfortable. And again, one of my points of naivete was when I thought, oh, well, then we're all just going to get vaccinated and then we're all just going to return. And that was my naive thought of spring 2021. And obviously that did not happen. And I mean, there are discussions about spring 2022 not being normal. And my institution has a vaccine mandate, so we will be 100% or close to it. You know, there are exemptions that will be considered, so we'll be close to 100% vaccinated. And there are discussions about whether to mask, and I don't know if I want to wade into that because that is a can of worms to open. But something that I do strongly believe in is that we need to find a way to approach these conversations from a place of mutually acknowledged humanity. And I think that that's what a lot of the discussion is missing right now.
Yep.
I really have witnessed a lot of discussions where people are afraid to discuss pros and cons for a certain policy or a certain idea. And they're afraid to discuss pros and cons because they're worried that they may be labeled as, you know, this pro-death person who just poo-poos death. And, you know, I think it's kind of crazy to say that, but it really, I've been in discussions with certain people, and I've said, well, let's consider the pros and cons of this. And I've been followed up with, well, someone I know has died of COVID and all this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that is horrible. I mean, that is absolutely horrible. And none of what I'm saying should attempt to undo that. And I think that's where the issue is there are people who are afraid to discuss pros and cons. And then on the other side of it, there have also been some toxic discussions where people are like, well, these people are scared of everything. Oh, if you're afraid of your own shadow, just hide in your house while the rest of us get back to normal life. I don't find that to be particularly compassionate either. So I'm sorry to both sides this, but I have to. That's who I am.
Yeah.
And I think it's really toxic. It's like one side thinks the other is pro-death, and the other side thinks the other are these, authoritarian hypochondriacs running around trying to take over the world. And I don't think that either of those things are true. And I think that we will not seek to have a productive discussion. And more importantly, kind of what I'm more passionate about solving is we will not have choirs that sing well if this is the type of discussion that we're having about returning.
Yeah. And if we don't have choirs that sing well, eventually we all lose our jobs.
Sure.
That is,
yeah.
and I think we underestimate that problem too, because at a certain point, people are attracted to activities that they feel like they're good at stuff. Like they feel like I want to be in the choir because I feel like I'm good at it at some level. And so we do have to focus on that. But yeah, that's a different podcast altogether, I think. But
right.
Here's another thing with this topic that I think is really important, where you talked about the toxic conversations and the both sidesing, which I think the correct answer with all of this has always been both sidesing, which is that, and I've kind of come out publicly as being a COVID centrist, meaning that there has been two sides the whole time, and they've both been wrong the whole time, which is that it's the apocalypse on one side, and they've been wrong. And then they also it's no big deal and it's all made up BS, which has also been wrong the whole time. And somewhere in the middle has been a very small but vocal minority of people who are willing to say, this is real, it's a big problem, but there are ways and tools with which we can navigate through this time and salvage the things that really do contribute to the human experience and to the human spirit, and that those things are not fluff. So we can't throw those things away while we protect ourselves from COVID, which has been my position really the whole time, which is, thinking about even the stuff that was said in the webinar about how there's just no way to come back safely and sing until there's a vaccine 2 years from now or whatever. And I'm like, okay, hold on. No, because if that might be true for my church choir, because they're all over 75.
Right.
But are you going to say that that's also true of my 14-year-olds? That, because that's just that calculation is so unbelievably different. We're talking about thousands and thousands of times different risk. And so let's have those types of conversations where we could say, okay, maybe the church choir is out for a year and a half or 2 years or whatever till the vaccine, but maybe the children's choirs could sing. And people didn't even want to have that conversation. It's like, are we going to pretend like it's all the same? Because it's not.
Which is interesting, because I'm actually a little bit more optimistic. I think that the people kind of outside of those two sides, I think it is a larger population than we may realize, because I have noticed that when I have conversations kind of privately with colleagues from other institutions as well, I've mostly agreed with kind of almost everything. And I'm pretty much the same area of the spectrum as you. I think I took a different journey. I certainly started more on the panic side, and that's because of my own proclivity towards health anxiety and all of these things. I have a personal issue with that, right? So, pre-pandemic, I always was thinking, I was always on WebMD and all of that. So I definitely had a lot of anxiety at the beginning of this. And for me, what brought me more to the center was a few things. It was kind of finding those different voices about harm reduction and learning about some of these really concerning issues with equity when you become hyperfixated on one issue. That issue being, COVID prevention, and then you forget about a lot of these other equity concerns. Oh, yeah. I try to be very aware of that because I'm from the Zoom class. I am able to sit at home. So I did hear a few different perspectives earlier on in the pandemic from people who were in the working class. I heard from some of my students who are working class people, and they talked with me about, well, I just don't have the luxury to stay home. So I am frustrated that I can't return to the classroom because I'm putting myself at risk anyway, because I have to work. And I had COVID and all these things. So I heard a lot of those different perspectives that I really tried to open my ears to. And then the other thing that where I really started kind of becoming very passionate about getting back on campus, at least having an option on campus for students, was when the vaccines came. I mean, the vaccines set me free. We'll put it that way. It released a lot of anxiety for me personally. And I will own that that's my opinion, and that may not be the same journey for someone else, and I totally respect that. But yeah, that's what brought me to the center. And now I'm rambling, and I forgot what we were even talking about.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm glad you just, I think I found a kindred spirit here, because you're bringing up a lot of the same issues and concerns that I was having. And yes, it comes from a slightly different journey, but that's the great thing about conversation, is that you discover that your starting places might have been very different, but we arrive at certain similarities and common ground. But when you bring up the equity issue, that was actually one of my first concerns, even in March of 2020, was because I've been an amateur student of economics my whole life. And one of the first things that got me hate on Facebook for posting in March of 2020 was when I posted, okay, guys, I know that you're all saying that we should lock ourselves in our house and not go to any restaurants and do anything for a few weeks. And maybe that's right. But just keep in mind that us in our posh Western civilization lives, middle class lives, if we stop doing commerce for a couple of weeks, people in third world countries will starve. Just so you know, and it won't take very long for that to happen. And they're like, oh, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about, capitalism, whatever. And of course, it was about 2 weeks after my post that the BBC came out with their first story about massive starvation in India. And I'm like, guys, our actions have consequences. There is no such thing as a solution to a problem. There are trade-offs. So we can try to solve a problem in our area while causing one somewhere else. And so what we should be doing, you just mentioned harm reduction. Harm reduction is the practice of doing just that, which is thinking, so I could try to reduce this risk, but what other risks might I create by doing those things? And I feel like that's the conversation we just have not been willing to have, especially in the wealthy West.
Right. And that's something that's going to be especially tricky for coral communities, right? It's a very, very tricky discussion to have. And I think that a lot of the vitriol that people face when they bring up, we'll call it a contrarian point of view, even though it doesn't seem that crazy. But I think a lot of the vitriol comes from a place of fear. And I think that's the most important thing to recognize, and kind of to steer this back towards our choral classrooms. It's like, we all have valid opinions. I hate to say that, but we all have valid emotions and opinions. And, or I don't hate to say it, but my point is, it's hard to bring it all together, because at the end of the day, I think what you say is valid. And then there's going to be someone who responds to that and says, well, no, because these people are the communities being hit the hardest from COVID. And so we have to make that consideration. I think there's some validity there too. I think I actually have found some validity in some of these arguments about concerns about freedoms. Not all of them, but some of these arguments I have gone, oh, well, actually, that's an interesting point of view. I may not agree with every application of it, but I think the main thing is when people are facing kind of what they think is a mortal threat, something like COVID, when we were being told, okay, this thing is really deadly. It's very unpredictable. I think that's what scared people the most, is like, oh, you may have absolutely no symptoms at all, or you could die. And we were not given a whole lot of clarity as to what's going on with that. So I think that lack of certainty and that lack of ability to control it creates just this visceral sense of fear.
Yeah.
And fear begets anger. Every time, almost every time. I mean, it is just such a tricky emotion to deal with. So what are we going to do and this is, I'm not a scientist. I'm not even an economist. I don't know how to look at this stuff the way that a lot of experts do. I know how to engage with it, but I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers in that. I'm not going to attempt. But what my job is to walk into my choral classroom after 18 months of a very traumatic pandemic for a lot of people. And I have to figure out what to do with all of those opinions and how to create a community where people feel safe, even though they're not 100% safe, but they feel safe enough to be there. They feel safe enough to exist, sing, trust. That's not an easy task in the current climate. It's just not an easy task. So I have worked really hard with my current group of students, and it's a wonderful group. It's such an awesome, amazing group of people. We're rehearsing outside still. We're on the third floor of a parking structure, and we're outside. And we do not have an outdoor mask mandate on our campus. So there are students who mask, there are students who don't mask. And I decided that I was not going to be particularly strict with that enforcement. Just because we are outside. I talked to several different health experts on Twitter. I talked to several different health experts about that before making that decision, and I felt comfortable with it, and I decided to make it. And I was open with the students, and I told them about the policy that we would be doing. And I tried to make myself very, very open with them, saying, if you're concerned, if you're scared, if you are frustrated that we can't be inside, I want you to feel like you can come and talk to me about these things, and I'm not going to judge you, and I'm not going to say that your opinion is wrong because this and that. And what that did was it created an environment where people are very open-minded, and I'm very impressed with my students. Similarly, there's another issue that we haven't really talked about, which is what happens when you do have people in your choir who come down with COVID. What do you do? How do you handle that? Of course, we can follow CDC. Okay, so you quarantine and testing and all of that good stuff. But what do you do with the emotion of your singers? The other people who were potentially exposed, the other people who are sitting there worrying now, oh, well, should I go near that person when they come back? Is it safe? That's really hairy too.
Well, see, that's interesting because that you bring that up as being a hairy. In my world, we're so far past that.
Yeah.
that's happened so many times. We've actually never had a case traced to choir, but we've had a ton of kids and adults everywhere in the building that have had COVID and missed school for 2 weeks and came back. Mostly, in fact, I know of one of my students. I've got 300 students or so. I know one that was more on the serious end of the cases. In that she had kind of a long COVID situation where like 3 months later, she was still not herself, that kind of a thing.
It's terrible.
But for the most part, it's been relatively mild, as most teenage cases are. And so it's interesting because it's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid in that sense, because once people have experienced that, it's hairy at first, it's scary at first, and then it becomes normal, which I would say is kind of how we have also reacted to the regulations around COVID. They were scary and weird at first, and now they're becoming normal, which kind of worries me in its own way. Being masked around each other all the time isn't really normal. So I'm concerned about that feeling normal, but so it's interesting because it's a regional thing also, just how many times have you been exposed to the no pun intended,
exposed to exposure
to the point where at first it's scary and then it's like, okay, this is just a thing that happens now.
Yeah, well, I did start the semester, and again, that is really fascinating because we're already, actually, we haven't yet, I'm sure this will change because we're about to head into winter, but we have not yet even had one of our students test positive for COVID during our semester. We've had them test positive. There was someone who tested positive, right before we began, and that was it. And so I know there's no way we're going to finish the school year without that changing. But for now, we've made it through 2 months without that happening. So I'm very, very grateful for that. But we have had suspected COVID cases that turned out to be something else,
Right.
confirmed with negative tests, and one of it ended up being flu, so it was, anyway, the point is we haven't had to deal with it. We've had to deal with potential COVID exposures. And how I started the semester was we went through the syllabus on day one, and then I put the syllabus down and said, all right, look me in the eye. In this choir, we do not blame people for being sick. In this choir, we do not shame people for their behaviors outside of the choir. We're not going to sit here and go, oh, well, that person did this last weekend, I don't want to be near them. Oh, that person believes this, so I don't feel safe near them. I understand where those emotions come from. And I understand that that's what a lot of discussion online has been in the last 18 plus months. And I know that we're all terrified, but I said in this choir, we don't do that. When someone gets sick, we support them. We ask them what we can do to help them. Uh-oh, is it frozen? Okay, it's back. So we support each other when we get sick. And we understand that in coming to campus, we have taken on a degree of risk, which, by the way, you did that before. We all did that before. So we're accepting that, and we are all agreeing that we're doing this together. And we're just not going to open the door to stigmatizing each other over an illness that is extremely contagious.
Yep.
It's so sad to me that we've kind of blamed people. And I've heard good friends of mine hear about people testing positive and going, oh, well, yeah, figures, that doesn't surprise me. And it's just I don't think that's healthy for us. I really don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I love that sentiment. And I because I'm kind of a snarky, sarcastic old man, I get that same sentiment across to my kids, but in a very different way. I just decide to make fun of that idea. And so because the progression for us has been at the beginning, like I said, it was scary when someone in the choir had COVID, and then we kind of got used to it. So at the beginning, it might have been like, hey, Mr. Muntz, I think Jake's got COVID. And now it's like, Jake's got COVID. It has changed quite a bit. And so, but that same sentiment that you're talking about of blame and of second guessing the behaviors. And so my joke has just been, Jake's got COVID, thinner.
Yeah, I'm too scared. I'm too scared to make those types of jokes. Yeah, no, I don't. I am very like kumbaya, and we're gonna care for each other. Very zen.
In a lot of ways, they're relieved by that humor in the sense that that they're worried that someone is going to judge the fact that their brother Jake's got COVID or whatever.
Totally.
And so that's my way of ripping off the Band-Aid or the awkwardness in the air or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, this happens, it happens. Somehow I still haven't gotten it. I don't know how that happened, but
neither have I. Yeah. Neither have I. It's crazy. I don't know how either, because I was extremely careful up until the vaccine. I mean, I didn't eat indoors in a restaurant once during COVID. But after the vaccine, I kind of, especially right after, I got out there and I still haven't had it yet. But I do anticipate that I have an appointment with it one day. It's like jury duty, that also that's kind of how I view it.
Also seems to be the consensus is that we all will, vaccinated or not. That's what endemic means. It's going to get it. We're going to all have a date with it. And of course, the best way to be when you do get it is vaccinated. That's where you want to be when you finally get it. And I think that was actually one of the interesting things that Dr. Adalja came on my show in May of 2020, right after the webinar, and told us even then that this is an endemic in the human population. It is not going away. And even when there's a vaccine, the risk of getting it won't be zero. There's no such thing as that. Like it doesn't exist. And so it was kind of echoing what you said earlier, which is that there will be a time where we have to be back and the risk won't be zero. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I guess what I'm curious about too in exploring is kind of discussing how to handle and how to approach the issues where you do have students, because I do have some students who indicated to me that they were uncomfortable. And now, and keeping in mind that I do teach college, I don't teach K through 12. So my students are given a lot more choice with the flexibility of their schedules than a K through 12 situation where, they have to go to school, right? Or they've been pulled out and they're doing something else. But my students have a great deal of flexibility, and this will be true for a lot of community choirs and professional choirs and all of that. And I do have some students that I suspect did not return. They indicated to me, I don't know if I would feel comfortable. And some of them didn't return, and some of them have returned, but I can tell that they're a little more uncomfortable than others. And so I do think, I agree with you. I think this thing is endemic. I think I've kind of personally made peace with the fact that I will meet COVID post-vaccine. I'm just kind of assuming it will happen. And I've made peace with it. I don't really want it to happen, but I am also not going to allow myself to, drown in anxiety over the fact that I may get a breakthrough infection. I likely will. Not everybody is there.
Right.
There are some people who aren't there yet. And we still have to serve those people too.
Yes.
And so I do worry, when these discussions are had between people like you and me who are kind of like, well, I've made peace with it. I do worry that there may be a forgetting of, there are people who still have to go on that journey. How can we make them feel good about this? And how can we bring them into the fold? How can we, because shouting data at people isn't always the most effective way to kind of convince them, because a lot of fear, it doesn't come from a totally controllable place. It's in your body, and it just is a part of you. And I'm someone who's like that. So I have a lot of compassion for people who are thinking, well, I don't know if I feel safe here. I don't know if choral singing is safe. What if we're like that choir in Washington? What if that happens? What if I'm the point whatever percent of the people that are low risk, but then they do end up in the hospital? I mean, I think that's certainly a really understandable human emotion. And we have to make sure that these people feel good as well, because if you have a situation where you have someone who's sitting in a choral rehearsal and they don't feel comfortable being around other people, I mean, you're not going to have a choir that is in harmony, literally and figuratively. Mm. So I'm curious to explore that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good thought. And one of the things that I think about that situation, I'm kind of a practical thinker in that way, that the singer in question, in my view, wouldn't necessarily be there at all if their fear was so strong that they weren't able to kind of work their way through it, or else they probably never would have walked in the door. And I am also concerned, though, that there are those people too that we will just never see again, like in our choirs.
And that just breaks my heart, because
yeah.
What I love so much about choral singing is that it brings together so many different personality types, so many different viewpoints, so many different people from all different walks of life. And so what I really don't want to see is that post-pandemic, there's just a certain type that is acquired. Do you know what I'm saying? I really hate to think about anybody being excluded. Though I suppose that's just a part of the journey that we're going to have to grapple with. Right.
Yeah, I think I guess the next layer of answer to your question, though, is that so let's say that there's somebody who's kind of in that middle ground of anxiety, where they are wanting to be there because they showed up and they've got their choir folder and they're ready to go, but they're kind of closed off because they're nervous, maybe a little bit uncomfortable around people again. I think that's where you hinted at this earlier, but that's where the director's job, and I think it sounds like you're already doing this, to be transparent and be open about, here's what the group's policy will be, because somebody's got to make one. But if you're uncomfortable with anything that's going on, I want you to recognize as a choir member that this is not Facebook. You can just come talk to me, because I might not be able to change the policy, but I can at least explain why I did it the way I did it. In a way that's not a judgmental conversation. And in my experience, having given little speeches like that to almost every choir that I've worked with in the last year, in almost every case, just the fact that I acknowledged that the elephant in the room has been enough. Like, I just want to know that I just want to know that the director is paying attention to this stuff and actually cares about this stuff. And then I feel more comfortable singing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I wrote a little bit about this in Tactus.
Yes, which
for the fall, which was
is going to be in the show notes. I'm going to put that in the show because it's a
great.
really good article. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I wrote it at the perfect time. I wrote it at the end of June when everyone was all happy and we were talking about, oh, we're definitely going to go back and we feel so good. And then, of course, about 3 weeks after I wrote it, they came out with all these new studies that, So anyways, to those who do read the article, please be kind to me. I wrote it in a different time. I wrote it pre-Delta. Well, not technically pre-Delta, but I wrote it pre-CDC guidance updating. And so if I were to write it now, I would have tweaked some of the policy bits. But I stand by the overall thesis, which is we have to approach discussions, and I'll say this again, I've been repeating myself, but we have to approach discussions from a place of mutually acknowledged humanity. We're not going to assign uncharitable intentions to people around us. And another topic that I explore in the article is we are forced to make some decisions that perhaps we are not even qualified to make. I am not an infectious disease epidemiologist. And at the beginning of this pandemic, I thought, well, they're going to tell me what to do and I'm just going to follow protocol. And that is not, the cookie is not crumbled that way. It has been really nerve-wracking. And so I felt the responsibility to really educate myself on a lot of the science with having absolutely no scientific background. So, I'm very much an armchair. Everything I've talked about on this podcast is my hot take from my living room. I have no science background. And we've been flying not completely blind, but we've been flying like not with 20/20 vision. We have had to make a lot of different decisions as choral directors. And then once we make a policy, we also have to decide how to enforce the policy and how intensely we're going to enforce that policy. It's really, really scary to do that. And so to all of the choral directors out there who are listening to this and think, oh, I don't know if I'm making the right choice. You are not alone. I mean, this is the craziest thing we have had to do. Yeah. But I do believe that when you make your decisions, you should make them with humility, and also you should make them with confidence. So what I mean by that is you should be humble enough to know that you may need to change your policy if new data comes forward, new information comes out. And also you have to say, this is what we're doing. I feel good about this. I've made these decisions because of X, Y, Z. Share that with your singers. These are the reasons that we're doing this. Mm-hmm. And here's what I think about it. Here's how I feel about it. And I know that you may not feel the same way. You may not feel good about this. So please talk to me. Please share with me that. And sometimes when you just tell people why, and you just said this, if you tell people why you've made the decision, for instance, I decided that I'm not going to make an outdoor mask mandate. My institution does not have one, and I'm not going to make a special one for choir. Some people may disagree with that decision, and I hope that I don't get myself in too much trouble with colleagues on here by saying this publicly. But I just made that decision, and I made it based off of my discussion with other experts. I made that based off of my knowledge of outdoor spread, which seems to be fairly limited. I made that with knowledge of my vaccine rate within the choir, which is very high and will be 100% by November 1st. So that's why I decided to do that. And when I told the students this, they seemed to be very responsive and open and comfortable. And I haven't had any issues yet. I always say yet. I never want to have to knock on wood, Yeah.
Well, you won't. If outside, I mean, because you're that spread outdoors being fairly limited is probably the understatement of the century. I mean, it's incredibly rare. And so, I think and with a vaccinated group, I mean, it'd be you'd be catching lightning in a bottle. but that's awesome. And I think that your approach is all very rational and very what should be in most choir directors' mind like kind of an obvious thing, which is that everywhere we go and where we live, as we've discussed, we all have different kind of health, local health mandates and local health rules. And we have to remember that in our country, this whole issue has become so politicized. But in most cases, you have some local group of experts who's looking at the situation where you live and making rules based on that. And it's different everywhere. So like if you're in some rural county in the middle of Kansas somewhere where there's only 100,000 people in the whole county in an area the size of Delaware, and there's only been 200 cases all for the last 3 months in the whole county, and all 200 of those cases were over in the meatpacking plant on Route K or whatever. They might very well be in a situation where they're still saying no masks because COVID is so rare in that area that and people in the cities and on the coast and stuff, we can't even like picture our lives that way. But the reality is that we all, I think my message really has just been, we have to give each other grace and understanding that it's not the same everywhere. And we as choir directors, as you said, are not qualified to make our own rules. We can maybe follow our health guidance, and beyond that, it's kind of the Wild West.
Right. And I also think that it's important to recognize exactly what you're saying. That when choir directors do have to make our own decisions, even though we're definitely not qualified to do so, we have been forced to anyway. Yeah. And so for that reason, I really think that people should feel empowered to make decisions that are right for their community. If you have a community of singers that is gung-ho about masking and they want to do that, and that's what you all feel comfortable based off of your area and everyone's good with that, then I think you should do that. So I'm not here to judge that, a decision that would be different from my decision either. I just think that if you start these conversations from, okay, what are our thoughts? What is this community made of? Who are the people in our community? And when I say community, I mean choral community, like I'm talking about my college and my singers. Who are those people? And I talk to them. I talk to my singers. Obviously, that's going to be more difficult if you're teaching elementary school or middle school. That's going to be, you have to deal with parents too, and you have to consider their input as well. But I do think that directors should feel empowered to make decisions that are right for their community. And I hope, and so far, I have to say, I'm quite optimistic. I haven't seen a ton within my circle, and maybe I'm just lucky. I haven't seen a ton of judgment. I do try and stay away from, the Facebook group that shall not be named when it comes to things like this, because things can get really toxic really quickly. But in my experience among my immediate colleagues in Southern California, I think everyone's been really wonderful and accepting, and we all have different situations, we all have different administrations, we all have different levels of comfort, and I think we've done a really nice job of supporting one another, picking up the phone, going, what are you doing? Oh, I'm trying this. Oh, well, I'm allowed to do this. And there are going to be differences of opinion there, but I have actually been very heartened by that process, at least in my immediate circle. So, but I have heard about that not being the case elsewhere. So hopefully that will inspire people elsewhere to not be judgmental about decisions that other people make, given the current context, given vaccines and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you chatting with me. This has been really fun.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. This is outside of my usual comfort zone. So I appreciate the chance to go on a podcast. Yeah,
it's been fun. It's a fun show to do just because we get to kind of have I'm glad you mentioned it towards the very end. This would be a good closing thought. The toxic Facebook groups.
I don't want to get in trouble.
No, it's good. It's good. My ratings soar through the roof when people argue about my show on those groups. It's great. But
don't yell at me in the Facebook group, please. I promise I'm nice.
You'll just yell at me. It'll be fine. But what's interesting about that, though, is that this show got its start in response to those groups, meaning I believed that these are the types of conversations that can occur between people, even though we're on Zoom, that you just couldn't have between text boxes back and forth on Facebook with, the people jumping in from outside of the conversation that don't even know you and didn't even start reading until like 4 comments down or whatever, and now all this out of context stuff. And I think that our profession, needs to have a little bit of that grace that we've been talking about, with understanding of different people reacting different ways and having different anxieties and different fears, and we all have different backgrounds, which is why we have different opinions. And that's such an important thing. So you've contributed to that tonight by you didn't yell at me one time. It was great.
No, I'm not sure why I would have, but I don't yell at many people. I mean, I come from an interesting background. My parents are politically opposite. And so I was raised in an environment where there would be some very passionate dinner table arguments. So, but they have a lot of love for each other at the end of the day, and a ton of respect for the other one's opinion. So I think I'm kind of a product of being raised in an environment where it's like, okay, both my parents don't agree on this politically. So I've had to kind of sit there, and I grew up in Washington, DC. So that's quite a place to enter that kind of dialogue. But yeah, so I agree with you. I think it's really important to have these back and forth dialogues, and Facebook can be great. I love Facebook, and I love the chance to get my thoughts together and write it out really carefully and read it over. And also, it does lack the necessary back and forth and the nuances and all of that. And I'm hoping that as we return to more in-person reactions, there will be a natural healing process, even without forcing it. I think naturally people will start to understand, oh, these people's fears are real. And then these people's desire to just get on with it, that's real too. I mean, everybody is valid. Every emotion is valid. So how do we take every valid emotion and create something productive with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Those are such great thoughts. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you later. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of the episode. I had a blast talking to Nicola, a kindred spirit, but also one, as we discussed in the episode, that came to some similar conclusions about what's going on in the world from a completely different perspective. You heard her talk about how in the beginning she was filled with a lot of anxiety. I never really was. I wanted to just know. My approach from the very beginning was I want to seek out information. Because and maybe this is, if you're going to psychoanalyze me listening at home, maybe that's my way of dealing with anxiety. In fact, it probably is. When I become anxious, when I become nervous about something new and crazy happening, I just want to go find out stuff. I'm a fact finder. I'm going to go find all that stuff. And everybody comes to their COVID positions, just like any other positions, because we're all different and we all have different backgrounds. We all have different life experiences, lessons we've learned, those types of things. And so it was refreshing to have a conversation with a colleague that sees that and that recognizes that. So that was exciting and awesome. And thank you for sticking around. Of course, well, actually, before we get to the very end, I just want to apologize if anyone is still here. That means you're a diehard. And I want to apologize for some audio weirdness. I'm noticing that Zoom, which is where I record with most of my guests, is doing some really weird things with the audio where it's like surging. All of a sudden, my voice will be really loud and grainy, and then it goes back to normal. That started happening a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know why. So I will be investigating how that is happening and why that's happening. And this is where the Patreon folks come in, because sometimes those types of fixes, I have to go out and buy something, some kind of new program. Maybe I have to move off Zoom. I'm not sure what's going on, but I want to have the audio be really good quality for you guys. So on the way out, if you are willing, share the episode. That's the one thing I'm missing. I need more help with that. Please share the episode just on your Facebook, on your Twitter. Hey, this is a cool podcast. Check this out. This conversation was very interesting. Anything like that is super helpful. Helps me beat the algorithm. Beyond that, liking, sharing, joining the Patreon page, patreon.com/Coralosophy, and leaving a rating on the Apple Podcast app is very important. About a third to almost a half of the audience is on the Apple Podcast app. So those ratings and reviews are very helpful. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you next time.